So I thought it might be helpful before we look at Judges 4 and 5. Quite a lot to explore, quite a lot to examine this morning. I thought it'd be helpful to recap a little bit what's been happening up until this point in the book of Judges. How have we arrived at this situation where we have the oppression of King Jabin? In this kind of culture, in our culture today, this isn't so strange, but in this kind of culture, it would have been incredibly strange for a woman to have been leading in Israel. So how did they get to this point in the story? It seems quite unusual that this would happen. How has this come to be? Well, let's remember, and we've heard it already a little bit this morning, but let's remember that Joshua and the tribes of Israel have thus far failed to do what God had commanded them to do with regard to the promised land. Rather than taking full possession of the land that God had promised them by destroying or driving out the Canaanites, they end up compromising. And rather than fulfilling the command to conquest, Israel instead opt to coexist with the Canaanites. We read in Judges 2 verse 10 that the generation following Joshua's knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. And so God's discipline followed. He hands them over to enemies, Judges 2:14. He actively fights against Israel in battle, Judges 2:15. But he also comes to their rescue by providing judges to save them in chapter 2:16. So you've heard this three-step cycle, this pattern already, that there is rebellion, ruin, and rescue. And this happens a couple of times already in Judges before we even get to chapter 4 with Othniel and with Ehud. And then after God's rescue of the Israelites through Ehud, they experienced 80 years of peace, and the cycle begins again in Judges 4. Verse 1 said, after Ehud died, the Israelites once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and the pattern repeats. The pattern of Judges 2:14-16, where there is rebellion, ruin, and rescue repeats. We discover a lot about the state of Israel and the state it was in during chapters 4 and 5. In verse 3 of chapter 4, we find out they're under cruel oppression by the Canaanites. The regular routes through Israel were largely abandoned. People avoided the main roads out of fear of this oppression. In chapter 5, verse 6, it could be that Canaanite chariots, the 900 chariots we read about, it could be that these are patrolling these routes and subjugating the people, oppressing the people. And then consequently, because of all of this, village life in Israel ceased. Chapter 5, verse 7. This indicates that the normal patterns of living and working and moving about had all changed. For me, I think about what it must be like to live on the Eastern Front in Ukraine, and you're close to the front lines. Village life is going to have ceased. It's going to look very different. It's unsafe to go out. Things don't look how they normally do. And then we also see in chapter 5, verse 8, that the men were not willing to fight. There was 40,000 men who could, but there wasn't a sword seen in any of their hands. And so there's this undercurrent in the passage of passive or abdicating leaders, particularly men who are not doing the kinds of things they ought to do. There's an unwillingness to fight. There is a lack of concern from the elders in Israel to restore village life. There is opposition, oppression, there is ruin coming, and no one is doing anything about it. So that's a little bit of what's happening in the context, but now there are several key people, and because we're doing 2 chapters, it's quite a complicated story. I wanted to just go through the actors, as it were, to remind us who these people are, and then we're going to see how it all fits together. And so, firstly, we heard about Jabin. Jabin ruled in Hazor, the major Canaanite city of the region. Hazor was in the north of Israel, right next to the tribe of Naphtali, which perhaps explains why it was Naphtali and Zebulun, those 2 northern tribes who went to fight primarily. And Judges 4 verse 2 told us that it was God. Remember, God is sovereign and faithful. He is faithful to his promises to discipline as well as his promises to rescue. And it was God that sold the Israelites into Jabin's hands. Then in the same verse we come across Sisera, the commander of Jabin's armies. Now Sisera was the one with the chariots. So you remember the iron chariots from chapter 1? Well, Sisera had 900 of them. We're talking about the sharp end of military technology here. We're talking about tanks versus infantry, and this particular infantry didn't have any British-made anti-chariot missiles. Then in verse 4, we have Deborah. Of course, Deborah is the main character here. She's introduced as a prophetess, the judge or leader of Israel, also called in chapter 5, verse 7, a mother in Israel. And really it's her action that God uses to transform the situation, to turn the situation around. But Deborah, unlike the rest of the judges, was not a military leader. Deborah was more like a judge that we would understand a judge to be, someone who hears disputes and listens and makes decisions and resolves those disputes. Then we have Barak. He lived in Naphtali, remember the tribe right next to Hazor, the north of Israel, and so he was well positioned to raise an army to go fight against Jabin and Sisera. It also explains why Deborah said to raise troops from those two tribes, because that's where they were, right next to Hazor, Jabin's seat of power. And next we're introduced to someone called Heber. He's a Kenite, and this is Jael's husband. Judges 1:16, if you remember that text, said that the descendants of Moses' father-in-law, if you remember him, Jethro, he's a Kenite. The descendants of Jethro went up from the city of palms with the men of Judah to live among the people of the desert of Judah in the Negev near Arad. And so Heber and his household are descendants of Jethro. They are related to Moses and the Israelites through marriage. They're an ally of Israel. But also in verse 17 of chapter 4, we read that Heber and Jabin had friendly relations. Okay, and so when you read it, you understand there's kind of two alliances going on here. There's the natural alliance that Heber and his household has with the people of Israel, but there's also, it's quite complex and political, all this. There's also this sense in which he's friendly with the Canaanite king. And if you read verses 11 to 12 of chapter 4, it at least seems possible to me that Heber could be the spy that's telling Sisera about Barak's army that's going to come and fight. So he could be someone who's passing information on to the enemy. And that would make sense because that's why Sisera goes there after the battle. Sisera loses the battle. He's the only one who survives. And he goes to the tent of Heber. He's thinking he's going to get safety and being looked after and protection. And that's where he meets the lovely Jael, the wife of Heber, the Kenite, who ends up getting significant praise and honor in chapter 5 because of her role in definitively ending Sisera's life. So that's the background. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of things going on. And so what are we going to do? How are we going to put this together and see implications that we need to pay attention to? Well, we're going to look at men and women and what responsibility looks like. We're going to look at whose victory this actually was in the first place. Who is it that won the victory on this day? Was it Deborah? Was it Barak? Was it Jael? Was it someone who stands above and behind all of that? Well, we'll find out. But first, let's look at men, women, and responsibility. Judges chapter 4 and 5 are often looked at as a great example of women in leadership. Deborah was indeed celebrated and honored for being a prophet and a leader in Israel. But I think what is more significant here is that Judges 4 and 5, rather than being a celebration of women in leadership, is more an indictment against men who abdicate responsibility. I think that's the way we should read it. It's not so much a celebration of women in leadership as much as it is an indictment against the men who should have been taking responsibility in the first place. First, Barak, arguably, is someone who abdicated responsibility. He will become celebrated as a hero in Israel in 1 Samuel 11. He's named in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11. But he still has this reluctance of Moses and the reluctance of Gideon. The kind of, I'm only going to do what God has told me to do if. I'm only going to be obedient if. There's a conditionality to Barak's obedience and willing to step out and do what God has commanded him to do. He says that he's only going to go fight if Deborah would go with him. And as a result, you read in the text that it says the way you're going about this means that the glory you would have got, the honor you would have got, is now going to go to a woman. But we also have some more subtle instances that I've already alluded to, but if we carefully read the text, we're going to see village life had ceased. Well, who in Israel was responsible for village life? It was the elders, it was the men, it was men who should have been taking charge, men who should have been protecting, providing, supporting, and leading. The enemy was running riot on the highways, and this no doubt had something at least to do with the fact that no one was willing to fight. 40,000 troops weren't willing to fight, weren't willing to pick up a sword and go to work. And so you have this abdication of male responsibility all over the place, this abdication of leadership happening all over the place. And what happens then is not just an abdication, but a major disobedience. The people that should have been leading and discipling others weren't, but what was even worse is they permitted the people, and perhaps joined in themselves, a forsaking of the God who was so faithful to them and bringing them to the promised land, and they literally worshipped idols. They chose new gods, we read in chapter 5. And perhaps if we wanted to think about this general lack of willingness to fight, it is shown in the case of Barak, the one who says, I'm a soldier, okay, I have an army to raise, but I'm only going to do it if Deborah goes with me. There is this lack of willingness, lack of confidence to go and do what a man should do. Nevertheless, God is gracious, and so he uses Deborah and Barak to reverse this. And it's for this reason that Judges chapter 5 verse 2 opens this song, which is really a commentary, an explanation, and a celebration of the victory that we read about happening in a narrative way in chapter 4. And it starts off by celebrating in verse 2 what happens when leaders lead and when people volunteer themselves. This is the way things should be. It was rare to see in this culture, in this particular context here, and so people found it very refreshing. Thank the Lord that he raised up leaders to lead, and thank the Lord that people followed. They went from this passive, leaderless situation, and through Deborah, through Barak, through Jael, God brought about a great victory, and used people in ways that I think would have brought a bit of a blush to the cheeks of those who'd been passive and absent in their responsibilities. You can imagine the rest of the fighting men who should have gone to war when the victory was won, standing at the sideline saying, I wish I'd have been a part of that. I wish I'd have gone to fight. I wish I'd have taken responsibility like they did. In fact, we didn't read those verses, but in the middle of chapter 5, you read a list of the different tribes, the different regions that did or didn't go to fight and join in the battle. And I'm just sure that the ones who didn't would have felt a certain sense of shame. But this awakening, this response to the oppression, the ruin that they were experiencing, didn't happen until 20 years had passed of cruel oppression. Again, this indicates this passivity, this lack of a willingness to take responsibility by the rulers of the tribes of Israel. Why did it take so long for anyone to notice what was happening? Why did it take so long for them to return to the Lord? Why did it take so long to repent? Well, friends, we know the answer to that, because it might not take us 20 years, but how often are we slow to return to the Lord? How often are we, like the Israelites, stubborn and hard-hearted and slow to go to God? Have you ever sinned repeatedly? I have. Have you ever had a habit, a proclivity to overspending, overeating, overdrinking, to lust, to gossip, to anger, to laziness, to abdicating responsibility, to whatever it might be? But have you ever gone back to it again and again and again? Well, the same can be said about Israel. And as Israel was slow to go to God and ask for his help, ask for his forgiveness, ask for his restoration, so too we understand, because we can be slow to go back to God. Our shame and our guilt and our repeated failure can so easily be something that becomes a reason in our minds to not go to God for help. Or have you ever sinned grievously? So not just repeatedly, but have you ever sinned grievously? Have you ever done something that no one knows about, but if they did, they'd certainly see you differently? And because of the seriousness of that sin, you likewise, like Israel, found yourself slow in going back to God, slow in returning to him, slow in asking him for help, slow in repenting. Have you ever found yourself, because of the depth and the seriousness of your sin, like Adam and Eve, hiding from God? But we hide. We don't seek God for his help or forgiveness, not because we sin too much and not because the sin is too great, but because we have, like Israel, forgotten who he is. Like Israel walked away from worshipping the true God and started trusting in, worshipping, following idols, so we too have put our trust elsewhere, and we have forgotten that he is faithful. We have forgotten that he is a God of grace. We have forgotten that he is a God of patience and loving kindness, and he is the God of forgiveness upon forgiveness upon forgiveness. And he stepped in and rescued Israel again here, and he will and does step in and rescue you again and again and again. And so the only reason we don't go back to God when we have sinned repeatedly or grievously is because we have forgotten that he is the God who forgives again and again and again. You keep going back to him. He won't reject you. He will do the same for you as he did for them. One of the profound lessons of Judges is that even in the midst of repetitive and grievous sin, God rescues, God helps, and God saves. And this step of going to God for help is an example, I think, of taking responsibility. One sign of a godly man is to do this, to take responsibility for his sin, but also to take responsibility even sometimes for the sins of others. A father is an example of someone who does this for his whole family. You can read about that in Ephesians 5:25 or 1 Timothy 3 verse 4. A pastor must one day give an account for the souls of the flock that God has entrusted to him. Hebrews 13 verse 17. It doesn't mean taking the blame, but it does mean bearing the weight. And so the mess you find yourself in, the mess I find myself in from time to time, is it your fault? Well, responsibility says, whether or not it's my fault, I will deal with this. I will go to God for help. I won't be passive in this. I won't play the blame game. I won't abdicate my responsibility. And if I come to the end of myself, I will go to God. And even if we don't get to the end of ourselves, we should go to God. But sadly, in our lives and in the lives of Israel, this decision for godly men to stand up and take responsibility tends to not happen very often and not very well. And we see that dynamic at play here. Deborah is indeed raised up, a mother in Israel. And note that this is, interestingly, not necessarily by the Lord. If you read about Othniel in chapter 3, verse 9, it says that he was raised up by God. Chapter 3, verse 15 says Ehud was given to Israel by God. Gideon, chapter 6, verse 12 and 22, the angel of the Lord, God himself raised up Gideon. And now what we have with Deborah is this, by implication, a different dynamic at play. The people have acknowledged Deborah and her leadership. The people are going to Deborah. Now, does that mean God hasn't appointed her? Not at all. God appoints people through various different ways and means. But there is an implication here that this is not the normal way things should be. There is an abdication of responsibility by a group of people, by the men. Where are they? Where are the men who should lead? And so the lesson here is not women don't have anything to bring at those high levels of society, not at all. Deborah was a remarkable leader. But the challenge to us, the point is, when men refuse to take the responsibility that they're called to take, then women end up taking twice the weight. And that is an abdication of responsibility. And because of Barak's response to Deborah, I won't go unless you go with me, the honor that would have been his goes to her, just like the weight that should have been his also falls on her in a certain degree. So Israel wins the battle. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but Israel wins the battle. Or I should say, God wins the battle on Israel's behalf. And then we read in chapter 5 that God had divinely orchestrated things. So God is the one who brought the victory, because we find that the chariots, these 900 iron chariots that would have absolutely devastated the army of Israel, humanly speaking, they found themselves bogged down in basically a floodplain. The rivers burst its banks, and now they're at the mercy of the Israelite army, and thus Sisera's army is utterly destroyed. Except, of course, for Sisera himself. Chapter 4, verse 15. He runs to the tent of Heber, someone who, as we've said, is friendly both to Israel and to Jabin, but who is possibly spying on Israel for Jabin. But one person who certainly isn't sitting on the fence is Heber's wife, Jael. Sisera doesn't know that at least she is wholeheartedly devoted to God's people. And like Barak seeks the protection of the mother of Israel, Deborah, as he goes into battle, so now Sisera seeks the protection of Jael, Heber's wife, who also mothers him. She literally tucks him in. He asks for water and she gives him a bowl of milk to drink, and off to sleep he goes, and then a vicious and uncompromising execution follows. Whether Jael was righting Heber's wrong, who I think had been spying, or whether she was just acting to defend Israel, or whether she genuinely understood God's command to defeat the Canaanites to the uttermost, I don't know. But one thing is for sure, that she is celebrated and called the most blessed of women in chapter 5, verse 24, whereas generations of men had previously failed to utterly destroy the Canaanites, which brought them to this mess in the first place. Jael made absolutely certain that the job was done. Absolutely certain that the job was done to the uttermost in this particular battle. And so Barak relies on Deborah to go with him into battle and ends up relying on Jael to finish the job. The honor is therefore shared in chapter 5 between the three of them, as an abdication of male responsibility that leads to women taking more than their fair share of the responsibility, and then they get more than the honor that would have been due to them in the first place. You see, men tend to abdicate responsibility. Women rarely have that choice. And I know this is very controversial in our culture to talk about things like this, but let me just give you a concrete example that proves the point. According to one charity that supports single parents in the UK, they say that there are currently 1.8 million solo parents, single parents in the UK, parents who are responsible for their children on their own. And out of those 1.8 million single parents, 90% of them are women. This is an abdication of male responsibility in our culture, in our context. And over 1.6 million of the 1.8 are women who are looking after the children, raising the children effectively on their own. And so what we have to understand is that it's not that women can't take responsibility. Don't hear that at all. I'm talking about men who abdicate responsibility are hurting and hindering and causing great strife to women. When men don't take responsibility in their family, when men don't take responsibility in the church, when men don't take responsibility in society, women will. And my point isn't that they shouldn't, it's that men should. But when men are passive, when men fail to take their responsibilities seriously, women end up carrying twice the fair share of the load. And that's why I think Judges 4 and 5 is an indictment on men who abdicate responsibility. The end of chapter 5. This is a song. This is poetry. It's quite amazing, quite clever. You are transported from the tent of Jael, where Jael is stood above her victim, stood above Sisera, who's, I love that part in the text that says, she hammered the tent peg through his head and he died. We figured that one out ourselves. But you get transported from the tent of Heber and Jael with Sisera lying dead at her feet, and you get transported to what was probably a luxurious manor house, where Sisera's mother's looking out of the window and she's expecting Sisera to return at any point, wondering what's delaying him. And so you're transported from the tent where he's lying on the floor to his mother who's looking out of the window, wondering, where is Sisera? What's taking him so long? And she's comforted by this thought. Her servants and her household are telling her it's probably because he's so busy plundering, he's so busy taking women for himself, he's so busy getting fine linens so that you can wear them. That's what is delaying him. That's what's causing him to tarry. So don't worry, he'll be back soon. He's just got a lot more plunder to carry than normal, a lot more slaves to transport than normal. And it's this quite dark, twisting, but victorious statement that there's this utter ruin and utter devastation to Sisera and his household. And Sisera is this extreme version of a man who has absolutely failed in his responsibilities as a man designed by God for certain responsibilities. He has not just abdicated his responsibilities to provide, to protect, to care for, but he is the man we find out in the text who is taking women captives for his own pleasure. And so we find a man who has used women, who has destroyed women, has been destroyed by Deborah and Jael, 2 women. They act faithfully even when others don't. And so we've seen that men have failed to take responsibility. We've seen that women have stepped in when that happens. We've seen some of the honor of the victory taken away from Barak and given to Jael, but even so, Barak, Jael, and Deborah all get their fair share of the glory, really, in chapter 5. Getting any glory at all, any honor at all, is more than our fair share, friends. But we see that Judges 5 verse 7 celebrates Deborah's rise. Judges 5 verse 12, 1 Samuel 11, Hebrews 11 talk about Barak's victory. Jael gets the most attention in our text, so she gets 4 verses in chapter 5 all to herself, giving her honor for the completion of the victory. However, there is, of course, someone else who gets more credit than any of these individuals. Judges 4 verse 6 says it is the Lord who has commanded Barak. Verse 7 says that the Lord will lure Sisera out and give him into Barak's hands. Verse 14 sees Deborah declaring that the Lord has already gone before Barak into the battle. Verse 23 says it was God who subdued Jabin. Chapter 5 verse 4 says it was the Lord who marched in battle. Verse 21 tells us of the river that God miraculously used to sweep the chariots away. And so we see the sovereign control and hand of God over the entire situation. And here's the promise, here's the principle, that God will always ultimately bring about victory for his people. God will win. He already has won. The war is won. The battles are still being fought, but the war is won. Judges chapter 5, verse 14 to 23, we didn't read it. You go read it in your own time, but we see a list of tribes and peoples. Some joined the war effort, and some didn't. Some had responsibilities that prevented them from going. Some had more reasons of abdication that prevented them from going. But one town that's mentioned really harshly is Meroz in verse 23 of chapter 5. And it says, "Curse Meroz, said the angel of the Lord. Curse its people bitterly, because they did not come to help the Lord against the mighty." Now, does God need our help? No. But it's saying that God invites our participation. And God has blessings and promises, as we've heard, for those who do what he has commanded us to do. And so the lesson, I think, is don't be passive. Don't be passive. Male or female, don't be passive. Don't abdicate your responsibility. Join the winning team. God wins. The victory is his. He will use barracks. Thank God. He will use barracks who need a bit of help. He will use Deborahs who are willing to take responsibility when no one else will. He'll even use people who previously wouldn't pick up a sword to go fight and win a great victory, and he will win on their behalf. But he will not use someone who refuses to get into the battle in the first place. He will not use Meroz. He will not use people who abdicate their responsibility, who worship false idols, and who walk away from his commands. He condemns those whose passivity and fear leads them to do nothing about the situation in which they find themselves in. And so we have to connect these two principles, taking responsibility and getting into the fight. For husbands and fathers, speaking from experience, it is a fight to take responsibility in your home. It is sometimes a fight to disciple the children. It can be a fight to love your wife as Christ loved the church. But I promise you, it's more of a fight for her to submit to you. But it's a fight, because these things require us to die to self. These things require us to put sin to death. These things require us to get into conflict with our own shame, our own guilt, our own sinfulness, our own failings, and to fight to obey Christ. The fight is hard, but we know, because the victory is guaranteed, we have the strength to endure. The Holy Spirit, we heard, who lives in us, who sanctifies us, who makes us more like Christ, who gives us the strength and the willingness in the first place to obey. He who began a good work in you will bring it to completion. He who promised is faithful. He's given you everything you need for life and godliness. He has promised to glorify those whom he's justified. So no matter how hard the fight looks, don't be like the passive elders of Israel who forgot their duty. Don't be the passive husband or passive father or passive boss or passive wife. Don't be passive like the town of Meroz. Take responsibility, because victory is guaranteed. As Jael stood above this enemy of Sisera, whose head the text says she had crushed. She's standing above an enemy whose head she had crushed in chapter 5, verse 26. We look to Jesus, who has also crushed the head of our enemy, the devil. And everything has been placed under Christ's feet. He won at Calvary. He is winning every day in our lives, and we know he will bring ultimate victory in the end. Jesus Christ is the ultimate example of someone who took responsibility. He fought for you, and he fought for me. And this is what this story points to. Romans chapter 5, verse 18 to 19 says, consequently, just as the result of one trespass was condemnation for all men, so also the result of one act of righteousness was justification that brings life for all men. For just as through the disobedience of the one man the many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of the one man, Christ, the many will be made righteous. And so because of Adam's sin, he has a responsibility in a sense that means all are lost. But because Jesus took responsibility for the sin that wasn't his, not in any way, shape or form was it his, because he lived a perfect life, because he went to the cross, because he died in your place and in my place, and because he won the great victory over sin, death and hell by rising from the dead, we can have forgiveness and we can have everlasting life. He was the only one who never sinned, but he was the only one who could take, because of that, your sin and my sin, and he would give us his righteousness. And so the lesson is, don't delay in turning to him. Don't be like the Israelites who waited 20 years. As he took responsibility, so we too can take responsibility to rely on him, to trust in him, to follow him, to obey him, to get into the fight, to take responsibility ourselves, and to ensure that we are there on the day of victory when he comes again. In Jesus' name.